Hillman sets a screen, rolls to the basket. Gray.
Welcome back to Clark USA fans. The reaction to what happened that night didn't just ripple through the arena, it exploded across the entire basketball world within minutes. This wasn't the kind of moment that people wait to analyze days later. It didn't need slow breakdowns or long debates to understand that something was off. Everyone watching, whether inside the building or through a screen, felt it immediately. The energy shifted in a way that was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just about a foul. It wasn't even just about one player. It felt like something bigger had just cracked open right in front of everyone. Because moments like that don't exist in isolation. They don't just appear out of nowhere. What people saw on that court in Indiana was the result of pressure that had been building quietly for a long time. Long before that shove ever happened, there were signs, small ones at first, easy to overlook unless you were paying close attention. Conversations behind closed doors. Frustrations that never made it to interviews. Teammates noticing patterns but choosing silence. The kind of tension that doesn't explode immediately but instead grows, layer by layer, until eventually it has nowhere left to go. And to understand why that moment hit so hard, you have to understand the environment it happened in. Because the WNBA that existed that night was not the same league it had been just a couple of years earlier. The transformation had been rapid, faster than almost anyone expected. For years, the league had been pushing for visibility, for relevance, for the kind of mainstream attention that other major sports leagues take for granted. Progress had come, but slowly, incrementally. Then suddenly, everything accelerated. Viewership numbers started climbing in ways that even optimistic projections hadn't predicted. Games that once struggled to fill seats were now drawing real crowds. Merchandise wasn't just available, it was moving. Conversations with sponsors shifted tone, turning from cautious interest into serious long-term investment discussions. The league was no longer asking to be noticed. It was being watched. Closely. Consistently. And with that attention came pressure, because attention always raises the stakes. At the center of that shift was one name that kept coming up again and again, Caitlin Clark. By the time she stepped into the league, she wasn't just another rookie. She carried with her an unprecedented level of attention, the kind that women's basketball had never experienced at that scale. Her arrival wasn't just a sports moment, it was a cultural one. Media coverage expanded beyond traditional sports outlets. Casual fans who had never tuned into a WNBA game before suddenly had a reason to watch. Entire audiences were forming around her presence alone. And that kind of spotlight does something to a league. It changes expectations. It changes dynamics. It changes how every game feels, not just for the fans, but for the players on the court. Because when one player becomes the focal point of that much attention, every interaction around them becomes amplified. Every success stands out more. Every mistake is scrutinized harder. And every opponent feels the weight of that spotlight in a different way. Clark, for her part, didn't shrink under it. If anything, she leaned into it. Night after night, she played with a level of control and confidence that made it clear she wasn't overwhelmed by the moment. On that night in Indiana, she was doing exactly what had brought her to that stage in the first place. Reading defenses before they could settle. Creating passing lanes that didn't seem to exist. Taking shots from distances that forced defenders into uncomfortable decisions. It wasn't just effective, it was disruptive.
Clock to one, Lloyd. Oh yeah! To Lloyd!
And disruption, especially in a competitive environment, doesn't just affect the scoreboard. It affects emotions. It affects rhythm. It affects confidence. For the opposing team, every possession started to feel like a problem with no clear solution. Defensive systems that normally held together began to break down. Communication slipped. Body language shifted. You could see it, not just in the plays, but in the reactions between them. The frustration wasn't loud yet, but it was there, building. That's the part most people don't immediately recognize. Frustration in sports doesn't always show up as shouting or obvious anger. Sometimes it's quieter. It sits beneath the surface, growing with each failed stop, each successful play by the opponent, each moment where control feels like it's slipping away. And when that frustration doesn't have an outlet, when it keeps building without release, it eventually finds one. That's the context that matters. Because what happened next wasn't just about a single decision in a single moment. It was the release of everything that had been building up to it. There was no scramble for the ball, no contested possession, no fast break collision. Caitlin Clark wasn't even engaged in an active play when it happened. And that's what made it so jarring. Chennedy Carter approached from behind and, without any basketball-related reason, delivered a forceful shove that sent Clark to the floor. It wasn't reactive. It wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. The reaction inside the arena wasn't immediate noise, it was silence. A kind of silence that doesn't come from confusion alone, but from disbelief.
Bounce pass, Burton, this would be for the lead at halftime. Oh, she banged!
Thousands of people, all processing the same moment at once, realizing that what they had just seen didn't fit into any familiar category of gameplay. This wasn't a hard foul in the heat of competition. It wasn't a physical play gone slightly too far. It was something else entirely. Players froze. Coaches paused mid-instruction. Even the referee's whistle felt delayed, almost disconnected from the moment itself. It took a second for reality to catch up, to register that this had actually happened in a professional game, on that stage, under that level of attention. And then came the replays. From every angle, in slow motion, the same conclusion repeated itself. There was no attempt at the ball, no misjudged timing, no contact initiated by Clark. Just a player walking up and making a decision. Analysts who had spent years covering the sport struggled to frame it within anything they had previously seen, because it didn't align with the usual explanations. It wasn't just emotional. It wasn't just competitive intensity. It crossed into something that the league couldn't easily categorize as part of the game. What happened immediately after was just as telling. Carter didn't look back, didn't check on Clark, didn't acknowledge the moment in any visible way. She walked away as if nothing unusual had occurred, as if it didn't require reflection or reaction. On the other side, Clark got up, composed herself, and continued playing. No dramatic gestures, no escalation, just a quiet return to the game. That contrast became a defining image. Two completely different responses to the same moment. One action that raised questions. One reaction that answered them without words. And from that point forward, the situation was no longer contained within the game itself. It moved beyond the court almost instantly. Discussions spread across media platforms, fan communities, and internal league conversations. Not just about what happened, but about what it meant. Because moments like that force organizations to respond not just to the action, but to the message it sends. The league had seen everything. The cameras had captured it clearly. There was no ambiguity to interpret. And behind the scenes, decisions began forming quickly. Not just about discipline, but about direction. Because how the league chose to respond would signal something much larger than the outcome of a single incident. When the official statement was released, the wording stood out immediately. It wasn't softened. It wasn't vague. It didn't attempt to minimize the situation. The language was direct, deliberate in a way that made it clear this was being taken seriously at the highest levels.
Got nothing to lose here in a game like this today, playing shorthanded without your top two.
Describing the action as inconsistent with the values of professional basketball wasn't just a formality. It was a message. And then came the consequence, an indefinite suspension tied to conditions for reinstatement. On the surface, that phrasing might sound procedural, like a structured path back. But inside the league, it was understood differently. Because conditions for reinstatement can vary widely in what they actually require. In this case, multiple perspectives suggested that those conditions weren't designed to be easily met. They weren't just corrective, they were restrictive. It created a situation where the punishment extended beyond immediate discipline. It introduced uncertainty. Not just about how long the suspension would last, but about whether a return was realistically possible at all. At the same time, the structure allowed the league to maintain a level of legal protection. It avoided the direct declaration of a permanent ban, while still establishing barriers significant enough to achieve a similar outcome. And that's where the situation becomes more complex. Because this wasn't just about enforcing rules. It was about defining standards. About deciding what the league represents at a moment when more people than ever are paying attention. The rise in visibility had brought opportunity, but also responsibility. Every major decision now carried more weight. Every action on and off the court contributed to how the league would be perceived moving forward. And in that context, the response to this incident wasn't just disciplinary, it was symbolic. It told players where the boundaries were. It told fans what to expect. And it signaled that the league was willing to take strong action to protect the direction it was heading in. But even with that clarity, the conversation didn't end. If anything, it expanded. Because behind every official statement are the questions that don't get addressed directly. The internal dynamics. The unspoken tensions. The factors that build over time but only become visible in moments like this. And that's why this story doesn't stop at the foul or even at the suspension. Because what happened that night wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a turning point, one that revealed underlying pressures, shifting power dynamics, and a league in the middle of rapid transformation. What comes next isn't just about one player's future. It's about how the league continues to evolve under a spotlight that's only getting brighter.
She can't believe it!
What the league constructed in the aftermath of that incident wasn't just a punishment. It was something far more calculated, something that looked procedural on the surface, but functioned very differently underneath. From the outside, it could be described as a suspension, a disciplinary action with a path to return. But when you start examining the structure more closely, it becomes clear that this wasn't designed as a temporary setback. It was engineered in a way that made the idea of a comeback feel more theoretical than realistic. Think of it less like a door that's temporarily closed and more like one that's locked with no clear key ever provided. The framework existed, yes, but the pathway through it was intentionally complex, layered with requirements that would challenge even the most disciplined professional athlete to complete, let alone someone trying to maintain peak competitive form at the same time. One of the most talked about conditions was the requirement of more than 500 hours of community service. On paper, that might sound like a meaningful corrective measure, something designed to reconnect a player with the broader community and reinforce accountability. But when placed in the context of a professional athlete's life, the reality becomes much more demanding. Completing that volume of service would take months of consistent effort, potentially stretching close to a full year depending on scheduling and availability. And during that time, the expectation to maintain elite-level athletic conditioning doesn't disappear. Professional basketball isn't something you can step away from casually and then return to at the same level. It requires constant training, repetition, and physical upkeep. Balancing those two demands simultaneously, intense community service obligations and the maintenance of competitive readiness, creates a near-impossible equation. But that was only one layer. Beyond the service requirement came a series of behavioral assessments, described as extensive and ongoing, but without any clearly defined endpoint. That lack of clarity matters more than it might initially seem. Because when a process has no fixed timeline, it shifts from being a measurable goal to something far more subjective. Progress becomes harder to track. Completion becomes harder to define. And the authority to decide when enough is enough rests entirely with the organization imposing the conditions. Then came the probationary phase, arguably the most restrictive element of all. Even if every prior requirement was met, even if the hours were completed and the assessments cleared, the return wouldn't be a full reset. Instead, it would come with limitations. Restrictions on movement.
Of X Factor's Ariel Atkins off balance.
Constraints on opportunities. A version of participation that existed, but under constant oversight and reduced flexibility. For any athlete, that kind of environment changes everything. It affects not just how you play, but how you're perceived. It shapes how teams evaluate you, how coaches plan around you, and how organizations decide whether you're worth the risk of bringing into their system. In a league where roster spots are limited and competition is constant, even small disadvantages can have major consequences. These weren't small disadvantages. Inside the league, people understood what this structure really meant. Off the record, some didn't even attempt to soften the language. One senior executive reportedly described it in stark terms, calling it career execution, a phrase that captured the underlying reality of the situation. Not a formal ban, not an official expulsion, but something that, in practical terms, could lead to the same outcome. And when you start looking at the financial impact, the weight of that outcome becomes even clearer. Most people hear the word suspension and think of temporary loss, missed games, missed paychecks, a pause in momentum. But in this case, the financial consequences extended far beyond that initial interruption. It began with lost contract money, the immediate earnings that disappear when a player is no longer active. But that was just the starting point. The endorsement landscape shifted almost instantly. Brands that had been in active discussions didn't just hesitate, they withdrew. In today's version of the WNBA, where player visibility is finally translating into meaningful sponsorship opportunities, those deals represent more than extra income. They're a critical part of a player's overall earning potential and long-term brand value. When those opportunities disappear, they don't always come back. Sponsorship decisions are often tied to momentum, public perception, and reliability. Once that pipeline closes, reopening it becomes significantly harder. And in a league where endorsement growth is still developing compared to larger sports markets, losing that momentum can have lasting effects. Then there are the opportunities that never materialize at all. Future contracts that won't be offered. Roster spots that will be filled by someone else. The ripple effect extends beyond active playing years as well. Coaching roles, broadcasting opportunities, mentorship positions, areas where former players often build second careers, can all be influenced by how a player's story is remembered. When analysts began estimating the total financial impact, the numbers reflected that broader reality. Loss projections reached into seven figures, with some estimates exceeding $1. $2 million over the course of a career. In a league where salaries are significantly lower than those in men's professional basketball, that level of loss isn't just a setback, it's transformative. It changes what a career looks like, both during and after competition. And that leads to a deeper question, one that sits beneath all the numbers and all the official language. Was this entire outcome truly about one moment on the court? Or was that moment simply the final trigger in a process that had been unfolding for years? Because disciplinary systems of this scale aren't usually built overnight. They don't appear fully formed in response to a single incident. More often, they develop over time, shaped by patterns, observations, and internal evaluations that never become public. By the time action is taken, the decision has often been influenced by a much larger body of context. Looking back at the trajectory leading up to this point, that possibility becomes harder to ignore. When Chennedy Carter entered the league as a high draft pick, the expectations were clear. She was seen as a dynamic talent, someone capable of making an immediate impact. Her athleticism, scoring ability, and competitive edge positioned her as a player with real potential to shape games and contribute at a high level. Early reactions reflected that optimism.
The last two games of this regular season is Citron takes and makes from deep.
Teams invest heavily in players like that, not just financially, but strategically. But within months, signs of tension began to emerge behind the scenes. In Atlanta, internal discussions started shifting in tone. What began as routine team management evolved into something more complicated. A confrontation between Carter and a teammate escalated beyond typical disagreement, reaching a level that drew attention throughout the organization. And what made that situation stand out wasn't just the conflict itself, it was who it involved. The teammate in question had a reputation for composure and positivity, someone widely viewed as stable within team environments. When friction reaches a breaking point with a personality like that, it raises different kinds of concerns. It suggests that the issue may not be isolated or situational, but part of a broader dynamic that affects how a team functions. Situations like that don't stay contained. They influence coaching decisions. They affect locker room atmosphere. They shape how organizations plan for the future. Even when they aren't publicly addressed, they leave an imprint. Eventually, That chapter closed, and a new opportunity emerged in a different city, with a new team and a fresh environment. On paper, it was the kind of reset that can redefine a career. New systems, new relationships, new expectations, everything needed for a clean start. But patterns have a way of following players when the underlying issues remain unresolved. In Los Angeles, similar challenges began to surface. This time, they appeared in settings that are less visible to fans but crucial to team development, film sessions, strategy meetings, the spaces where trust and cohesion are built. Repeated interruptions, dismissals of coaching input, and disengagement from team processes began to form a pattern. Not as isolated incidents, but as recurring behavior that the organization had to manage. And management can only go so far before it becomes unsustainable. The decision that followed was one that continues to stand out within league circles. Rather than pursuing a trade or attempting to restructure the situation, the organization chose to absorb a significant financial cost simply to move on. Paying a substantial portion of salary to release a player isn't a typical move, especially in a league where every dollar of the salary cap carries weight. That kind of decision sends a message, not publicly, but internally. It reflects a calculation that the cost of continuing the situation outweighs the financial loss of ending it. It's not just about performance.
Deep. KT even put it in.
It's about impact on the team as a whole. From there, the move to Chicago represented another opportunity. Another chance to stabilize, to integrate, to move forward. But by this point, the context surrounding the player had already begun to take shape. And then came the moment that brought everything into full view. Because when that shove happened on the court, it wasn't being evaluated in isolation. It was being viewed through the lens of everything that had come before it. Every prior incident, every internal report, every decision made by previous organizations. All of it formed the backdrop against which that single action was judged. What followed within the team environment added another layer to the story. In a league known for its culture of solidarity, where players often support each other publicly during moments of controversy, the response was noticeably absent. No statements, no expressions of support, no visible defense from teammates. In most situations, that kind of silence would be surprising. In this context, it carried meaning. Because silence, especially in a culture built on collective voice, is rarely neutral. It reflects a decision. A choice not to engage, not to defend, not to align publicly. And then there were the individual signals. Social media activity, often dismissed as trivial, began to form a pattern when viewed collectively. Connections that once appeared visible started to disappear. Interactions that suggested camaraderie were replaced by distance. Even subtle changes, unfollows, absence from group content, indirect messaging began to point in a consistent direction. Individually, each of those details might seem insignificant, easy to overlook, easy to explain away, but together, they create a picture. Not a definitive one, but a suggestive one. The kind that indicates shifts in relationships, changes in perception, and underlying dynamics that don't always surface in official narratives. And that's what makes this situation so complex. Because it's not just about one action, one punishment, or one player. It's about how all of those elements intersect over time, how patterns develop, how organizations respond, and how, eventually, everything converges into a moment that forces a decision. What happened on that court may have been the most visible part of the story, but it was not the only part. And as the league continues to evolve, the implications of that moment and the response to it will continue to shape how similar situations are handled in the future.
At his first three of the game and does it with 1/10 of a second left.
By the time everything finally came into public view, the reality inside that locker room had already been shifting for a long time. What people saw on the court in Indiana wasn't the beginning of the story. It was the moment when everything that had been building behind the scenes could no longer stay hidden. When you look closely at the patterns leading up to it, the small details, the subtle changes in behavior, the quiet distancing between teammates, it becomes clear that this wasn't sudden. It was gradual. It was developing piece by piece, long before anyone outside the organization realized what was happening. Those moments, unfollows, absences from team interactions, cryptic messages, weren't random coincidences. They were signals. Signals from people who were experiencing the situation from the inside, watching dynamics shift in real time. These weren't things that show up in official statements or post-game interviews. They don't make headlines when they first happen because, individually, they're easy to dismiss. But when you put them together, they tell a story. A story of a locker room that had already started creating distance, already begun adjusting to something it couldn't fully control. And by the time the incident in Indiana happened, that distance had already been established. What makes the entire situation even more striking is how small the window was to change its direction. It wouldn't have taken a major campaign or a long explanation. It wouldn't have required weeks of repair. In reality, it could have been altered in less than a minute. A brief moment of clarity. A direct acknowledgement. Something as simple as saying, "I crossed the line and I take responsibility for it." That kind of response matters in professional sports more than people often realize. It doesn't erase what happened, but it reframes it. It shows awareness. It signals growth. It gives organizations something to work with, something they can point to when deciding how to move forward. Accountability doesn't just affect public perception, it directly influences how decisions are made behind closed doors. That opportunity was there. And it came at the post-game press conference, a setting where narratives are often shaped in real time. Cameras were on. Questions were coming. The moment was still fresh. It was the exact point where the tone of the entire situation could have shifted. Instead, the response went in a completely different direction.
Over 2K in her career, and a statement first quarter for Sam.
Walking into that room, the body language already spoke before any words were said. Arms crossed. Visible frustration. A sense of disengagement that set the tone immediately. When the first direct question came about the incident, the answer didn't address it in a meaningful way. It was brushed aside, framed as something already in the past, something not worth revisiting. When pressed further, the stance didn't soften, it solidified. There was no indication of reflection, no acknowledgement of the impact, no suggestion that the moment carried weight beyond the game itself. And that's what made it significant. Because at that point, it wasn't about the shove anymore. In professional sports, mistakes happen. Emotions run high. Physical play crosses lines. Leagues, teams, and fans all understand that. What matters is how those moments are handled afterward. The response becomes just as important, sometimes more important, than the action itself. What that press conference revealed wasn't just a lack of apology. It suggested a lack of recognition, a disconnect between the action and its consequences. And for the people making decisions within the league, that kind of disconnect raises concerns that go beyond a single incident. Observers who had covered the league for years recognized it immediately. It wasn't just another tense media moment. It felt like something more final. Like watching a turning point unfold in real time, where the direction of a career shifts not because of one mistake, but because of how that mistake is processed or not processed. Shortly after that, the league made its move. And for those who had seen that press conference, the decision didn't come as a surprise. Now compare that to how the other side of the situation was handled. Caitlin Clark was in her first professional season, navigating a level of attention that few athletes, rookies especially, have ever experienced. Every game was being watched closely, every performance analyzed, every reaction scrutinized. The pressure was constant, and it was intense. Then, in the middle of all that, she was shoved to the floor on national television. Moments like that can easily escalate. They can turn into ongoing narratives, fuel media cycles, and create distractions that follow a player for weeks. There are countless ways to respond, some emotional, some strategic, some designed to control the narrative. Clark chose a different path. She got up, continued playing, and when the next game came, she showed up ready to compete again. In interviews, when the incident was brought up, she didn't expand on it. She didn't lean into the attention. She redirected the conversation back to basketball, back to team goals, back to what actually mattered in the long term. There was no performance in it. No visible attempt to appear composed. It was simply consistent behavior, focused, controlled, and aligned with the expectations of a professional environment. That kind of response doesn't always get the same immediate attention as controversy, but within the league, it doesn't go unnoticed. Players, coaches, and analysts recognize it for what it is, a demonstration of composure under pressure. And that's something that can't be easily taught. It's something that shows itself in moments like that. The contrast between the two responses became impossible to ignore. On one side, a moment that escalated beyond the game, followed by a reaction that didn't acknowledge its impact. On the other, a player who absorbed the moment, minimized the noise, and continued forward without adding to it. And in a league that is growing, evolving, and attracting more attention than ever before, those differences matter. Because the WNBA is no longer operating in the same environment it was years ago. The stakes are higher. The visibility is greater. The expectations, both internally and externally, are rising. Every major decision now contributes to shaping the league's identity moving forward. That includes how discipline is handled. It includes what behaviors are tolerated and what crosses the line. And it includes how players carry themselves in moments when the spotlight is at its brightest. The opportunities beyond the league also reflect those changes. There was a time when international basketball offered a relatively open path for players looking to extend their careers or find new opportunities. Talent was often the primary factor. If you could perform, doors would open. That landscape has changed. Teams overseas, just like those in the WNBA, are placing greater emphasis on professionalism, chemistry, and reliability. Skill still matters, but it's no longer the only consideration. Organizations are investing more carefully, evaluating not just what a player can do on the court, but how they fit within a team structure. For players carrying public controversies or documented behavioral concerns, that shift creates additional barriers. Opportunities that might have been available in the past are now harder to secure. Decisions are more cautious. Reputations carry more weight. And in the digital age, where information is easily accessible and widely shared, those reputations don't fade quickly. Moments get recorded, circulated, and revisited. They become part of a player's public profile in a way that wasn't as permanent before. Financially, the impact compounds. Contracts that would have been signed don't materialize. Sponsorships that were in progress disappear. Long-term earning potential shifts dramatically. When analysts compare the trajectory that once seemed likely to the reality that follows an incident like this, the gap becomes significant, reaching into the millions over time. For a player still in their mid-20s, with the physical tools and talent to build a long career, that shift is profound. It's not the result of injury.
Phoenix, a little bit of a...
It's not bad timing. It's not external circumstances beyond control. It comes down to decisions. And decisions, unlike injuries, don't heal with time alone. They require recognition, adjustment, and change. Without that process, patterns tend to repeat. And in professional sports, repeated patterns eventually lead to consequences. The league's response, in this case, sent a message that extended far beyond one individual situation. It signaled that the standards are changing. That growth comes with increased expectations. That as the league gains visibility, it will also enforce a level of professionalism that matches that visibility. This wasn't just about discipline, it was about direction. The WNBA is experiencing one of the most significant periods of growth in its history. Viewership is rising. Fan engagement is expanding. Commercial interest is increasing. The league is building momentum, and with that momentum comes a need to protect the environment that supports it. Every major decision contributes to that effort. And that's why this situation will be remembered, not just as an isolated incident, but as a defining moment in how the league chooses to move forward. For Chennedy Carter, the future remains uncertain. Opportunities may still exist, but they will come with challenges that didn't exist before. The path forward is no longer straightforward. For the league, the message has already been delivered. Talent can open the door, but professionalism is what keeps it open. And when those two things don't align, The outcome becomes inevitable, not because of one moment, but because of everything that led up to it. The story doesn't end here. It continues in how players respond, how teams adapt, and how the league evolves from this point on. And as always, we'll be right here breaking it all down with you.